right, guys. Hey, hope y'all are doing well. I just wanted to put a video out for review purposes, exactly what you're going to need to know for tomorrow's test. Just to give you an idea, so what we've covered so far and what we covered on the videos that I put out yesterday, the information, the PowerPoints that I've put out so far, couple of things. So, starting with what we covered yesterday, economic indicators. These are things that economists will use to kind of gauge how well an economy is doing, trying to get a feel for how well the economy is growing. And we looked at information such as unemployment. We looked at information such as the inflation rates and things like that. These are two things that economists will look at to kind of gauge the economic health of a nation. And last but not least, and probably the best economic indicator that economists will use is GDP. Make sure to look over the PowerPoint on GDP. When you're looking at that, what GDP is, gross domestic product. This is basically kind of a bill of health of the nation. All right, how well are we growing? It's meant to show growth. Hopefully to show growth. But what GDP is, with your gross domestic product, how much is the nation, or how much is that particular economy making? How much money are they making? How well are they doing? How well are their businesses doing? All right, all of that is factored into GDP. When we talk about GDP, and one of the first things that I want to kind of bring up from that PowerPoint is real versus nominal GDP. The difference isn't too big. One, which is real GDP, is going to adjust for inflation, while nominal is not. The reason that that's important is because when you're looking in past years, and let's say that you want to look back at 2010. So 2010, you want to check out the GDP, what it was in that particular year. If you look in 2010, back in in the nation's records, and you see what GDP is, let's say that it was demonstrating at that point in time a 1% growth, then that's your GDP in your base year. So the base year GDP is nominal GDP, okay? There's no need to adjust for inflation because you're just looking back at a particular point in history. Where you have to start adjusting for inflation is, let's say if you want to go back and look at 2010 and compare it to 2017, all right? How has GDP changed throughout those years? That's when you will need to adjust for inflation. So when you're comparing, you'll need to adjust for inflation. So again, you would look back and say, okay, in 2010, GDP, our gross national product, it showed an economic growth of about 1%. And then in 2017, it has showed a growth of about 3%. Yeah, I'm making these numbers completely up. Say, for example, that's what it shows. If it shows that in 2017 it's 3%, to make sure that you're not getting an inflated sense of the economy, that's why you need to adjust for inflation over the years, to make sure that the evidence that you have, the data that you've collected on GDP, that is accurately represented. Okay, so that's mainly all that's talking about. What you'll definitely need to know as far as what GDP actually is, you'll need to know what makes up GDP, the components of GDP. So that's consumption. All right, the biggest part of what makes GDP, or what makes up GDP, is going to be consumption. And this has to do with what consumers buy. And these are going to be new products that consumers buy. Okay, so basically everything that we go out and we buy, that's factored into GDP. New houses, those are commonly used things that we look at the housing market as a whole to see if new houses are being bought or new cars being bought. Everything that's new factors into GDP. Now, the reason I'm making a big deal about it being new is because if it's a used house, if it's a used car, that stuff does not factor into GDP because it factored into GDP in its base year when it was produced. Okay, so it has to be new items, things that are bought, that factors into GDP. As far as and that's not to say no single economic indicator is going to be the economic indicator that tells all about the economic status, the economic progress of a nation. But we can use these things, inflation rates, unemployment rates, GDP, we can kind of look at it as a whole and get an idea of how well the economy is doing. And so even though GDP doesn't show things like, used cars, used houses being bought, people might be doing fine. There still might be economic growth, but people might just not be buying new. So I mean, like, it doesn't show everything, but it does give us a pretty good idea of how well an economy is doing. So you got consumption as component level number one. Component number two would be business investment. Are businesses making enough money to reinvest in their companies? Are they buying new capital? Are they paying new labor? Are they expanding? Are they reinvesting in their company? All right, that type of stuff factors into GDP. Government expenditures. Okay, if the government is taking in tax dollars and they are spending it in certain areas of the economy, how much are they spending it and where are they spending it? That factors into GDP. And then the fourth component of GDP is going to have to do with trade. It has to do with exports. Ideally, you would like a situation where you are exporting more goods than you're importing. All right, so we're selling more than we're buying. But that's just not the case for America. The United States, we are going to be importing a lot more than we export, just because of the nature of our exports and how we can get goods cheaper from other places. We'll get into that when we talk about international trade, but just wanted to throw that out there. So make sure you know the four components of GDP. Make sure you know what GDP is, the difference in between real and nominal. Generally a healthy GDP is going to be around 3%. Of course, we'd like to see it increase from there, but you want to see and you want to demonstrate growth with your GDP. That's the main thing. All right. Moving into the next little piece, I talked just a second about government expenditures and them taking your tax dollars and spending it in certain areas. So to hit on taxes for just a second, there was a PowerPoint on taxes. Hopefully you got a chance to see that. And this factors into how the government takes tax dollars and how they can best spend it, how these government expenditures can help us, and how through that process the government sets fiscal policy. So the government is basically in charge of setting that fiscal policy, and they use money that is our money as a whole, all right, our tax dollars as a whole. So the way that it kind of works, all right, there's several different taxes. There's a ton of different taxes, and we're going to focus on the major taxes for this particular unit. So you'll have the first tax that we come across, and the one that we'll all experience. You've probably already experienced it if you've had a job. Federal income taxes. All right, with federal income taxes, in our nation, we have a progressive federal income tax. All right, meaning that the more money you make, the higher tax brackets that you fall into, and the more money that you end up paying out in taxes. Now, states are a little bit different, but speaking about the federal income tax, if you've ever had a job and you've gotten your pay stub and it shows you what taxes have been taken out, you might see something that says FICA. That is basically the major tax that is going to be taken out in the form of withholding. That tax is taken out before you actually get your paycheck. It's a payroll tax. Basically, that money is not coming your way; it's being withheld from you, right? Those particular dollars, that tax money, goes to paying for basically what are called entitlement programs. Things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There's a lot of different corporations, a lot of safety net, not corporations, I'm sorry, a lot of different programs. But there's a lot of safety net programs that are there as well. And the idea behind that is that you pay into it over the course of your career. You pay for things like Medicare, and you pay for things like Social Security, and then when you reach retirement age, you've been paying into it your whole life, then you can reap the rewards of having that supplemental health insurance and also the supplemental retirement coming your way in the form of Social Security, which, by the way, throwing this out there, and we can discuss this tomorrow if you want to, but Social Security, Medicare, as it stands right now, is kind of in trouble. Social Security especially is probably not going to be there by the time that we reach retirement age, so something needs to be done with that. The reason for that, it was never a program that was really meant to last longer. It was a Great Depression initiative, and it was never meant to really last as long as it has. It's just always been renewed. Um, and now we have private organizations that could actually take care of that a little bit better. But since it's so heavily ingrained and you have so many people that have paid into it, it's kind of expected that the government's going to keep it going. But after World War II, you had a lot of babies that were born, the baby boomer generation. Right? If your parents or grandparents were born between 1945 and 1960, they're in that baby boomer generation. And the baby boomers are now reaching retirement age. And you're about to have a situation where you have, because people are living longer, which is always a good thing, and because you have a lot of people that are about to retire, you're going to have more people that are drawing on Social Security than there are paying into it. Now, some of that's been helped because you have the unemployment rate, for example, is close to a record low now. You have a lot of people that are pouring money into that system. However, it's just not equipped to take that big of a hit as it's about to take. So something's going to have to be done. Anyway, I'm stepping down off my soapbox. We're done. But moving in, that's basically where your federal income taxes are going. Now, state income tax is a little different, but federal income taxes go towards basically a lot of these safety net entitlement programs. So that's one area. Another area that we're always going to experience, and you've already experienced this as well if you've bought anything, sales tax. Sales taxes are going to be governed by the states, and sales taxes can be applied to anything that you're going to buy. That sales tax is passed on. The final burden of the tax falls on you, the person that buys that product, and you're responsible for paying that 8%, for example, in our case in Georgia, that 8% tax on whatever it is that you buy. Those taxes are going to go towards paying for things in those states, all right? Things such as the maintenance of roads, things such as parks, libraries, public facilities that are going to be used, lighting on the streets, all right? All of that stuff that's a public good or public service, it goes towards paying for that stuff. Now, with a sales tax, sales taxes are often seen. Matter of fact, I'm gonna come back to that here in just a second. So you have sales tax. Sales tax, everything that you buy is going to have a tax that's going to be placed to it. In certain states, as a matter of fact, certain states like Florida and Tennessee have actually gotten rid of their state income tax in favor of raising the sales tax in their states. And that's usually something that you see with states that experience a high level of tourism. A lot of people go to, in Tennessee, places like Nashville, Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Memphis. In Florida, well, people go all over Florida. And since they experience a high number of people that come there and are tourists, they're buying stuff. It's actually beneficial for them to have that higher state sales tax. Right? It goes towards paying for a lot more. So you might run into that. And then the third major type of tax that we're going to be discussing in here for our purposes is going to be something that whether you're renting or whether you're buying a home, you're going to experience, and that's property taxes. Property taxes are going to be placed on the value of the property and your assets. These taxes are going to go towards mainly, a large portion of them go towards paying for things like schools in the particular county in which you live. And that's often reflected in the schools, all right? Just kind of the way it is. So those are your three major taxes that I definitely want you to have an idea about. And now I want to kind of pivot to the type of taxes that they are and how they're administered. And so with the taxes in the United States, they are generally either progressive taxes, regressive taxes, or proportional taxes. So and I'm going to give you an example of each that match up with the taxes that we just talked about. So we talked about the income taxes, federal income taxes being progressive. And what that means, progressive structure taxes are meant to really tax people who make more money at a higher rate. All right, it has a much stronger impact on people that make more money than people that make less money. As seen with our tax structures, right? The more money you make, the higher tax bracket you fall into, and the more money that you end up paying out in taxes. All right, I actually have a sheet on this if you'd like to look it over. It's like an example that you can look at, and it's coming from a professor at the University of Georgia that kind of, in layman's terms, was trying to explain taxes. But you can look at that. That's on Google Classroom. With a sales tax, of course, the government is not going to try to implement any type of tax that is going to be geared towards being more punitive towards lower income individuals than higher income individuals. But some taxes are like that by nature. A sales tax is often seen as regressive. The reason being, and before he was president, I used to use this analogy a lot. Donald Trump is a billionaire. All right, if he were to go to Walmart and let's say that he was in the market to buy a bicycle, I'm in the market to buy a bicycle as well. We both are there at Walmart. We see the same bicycle we want, and we purchase that same identical exact bicycle, right? And let's say it's $120. I get up to the cash register. I pay the $120. I'm a teacher. All right, the tax that goes along with paying for that bicycle is going to impact me a lot more than, say, a billionaire who is buying that same bicycle, right? So sales taxes are by nature regressive. There is a stronger impact on lower income individuals than there are on higher income individuals. And then last but not least, the proportional tax. All right, proportional taxes are those who affect everybody equally. And an example of this would be the property taxes that we see. Property taxes, because if you live in a particular area, in a particular neighborhood, or in a particular county, you can expect property taxes to be about the same. Okay, now they are going to fluctuate, all right, but it's proportional kind of across the board based on where you live, the county you live in, and the type of neighborhood in which you choose to live. Okay, so we got those. Now, as the government is taking in that money, they're going to be taking in the tax dollars. All right, we talked about states taking in sales tax revenues that go towards paying for things like public utilities, public services, and public goods that we use, things like libraries, road maintenance, power lines, lighting fixtures, anything like that, public libraries, public restrooms, all that stuff, right? It's all paid for through tax money. And a state is in charge of that. When the federal government takes in your personal income tax, okay, and they're taking in that tax revenue, they're going to be spending it in a lot of different areas. Now, based on what the nation needs at the time, based on the type of politics that are popular or fashionable at the time, based on the administration that is in office, that is going to differ, okay? And so when you look over the government expenditures PowerPoint and when you look over fiscal policy, make sure to take into account what fiscal policy is. And we hit on this a little bit in some of the other videos, but with fiscal policy, it can either be expansionary or contractionary, with the goal of basically expanding the economy, trying to get it to grow, or trying to get it to expand, or contracting it based on what we need to do. And a lot of that is in regards to inflation and how much money is in circulation and things like that. And if they're trying to stimulate the economy, then you might see things like lower taxes. You might see the government that is going to be, they may be selling government securities. They may be selling bonds. And when they do that, by the way, that releases money. That releases money back into the people's hands. Okay. So basically, when you have a situation like that occurring, it's meant to release money to get the money flowing through an economy. Okay. So when you're looking over that particular PowerPoint, again, take in what the government is doing and how they do it, and what you're likely to see happening in the economy should the government be issuing an expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, and then the last thing that I wanted to discuss was the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve is basically our nation's bank, and you can think of it as the bank of our government and also the bank of our banks. Okay, So what do I mean by that? So the government does have a bank, the Federal Reserve. All right, the Federal Reserve is structured in a way that it is meant to kind of obtain information as far as the economic climate across the nation. Because if you look at a place like Mississippi, for example, the economy in Mississippi is vastly different from the economy in New York. It's vastly different from the economy in California. And so it's important to keep in mind that when we are conducting monetary policy and when we're coming up with these policies and trying to figure out what to do, it should be a best fit scenario. It should be what benefits the economy as a whole. And so we need to come together to hear about the economic climate in the South and the West and the Northwest and the Northeast or whatever it may be. Okay. With the Federal Reserve, there are 12 Federal Reserve banks. Our personal regional bank, that covers most of the Southeast, is located in Atlanta. And again, when you're looking over that PowerPoint, take into account the structure of the Federal Reserve, what it looks like, how it operates, all right, how it gets information from the grassroots levels, from business owners, from bankers, what they see happening. Or a lot of people, what they'll ask themselves is, are a lot of people taking out loans? Are a lot of people investing in their companies? Are a lot of people spending money? Is there a lot of are there a lot of people buying things from these particular businesses? And if the answer is yes, then you're talking about a lot of money that's going into circulation. And so what the Federal Reserve might think about doing, if that's true throughout the whole nation, if we see that commonly happening, the Federal Reserve chairperson may decide that it's in the best interest of the nation to conduct a tight money policy at this point in time, maybe raise interest rates, and that way that will discourage people from taking out loans. It'll discourage people from investing or growing their companies at this point in time and try to, over time, shrink the amount of money in circulation. Okay? On the flip side, if things need to be stimulated, if the housing market is down, if people are not investing in their businesses, if there's not a lot of consumption going on, then you might see the Federal Reserve issue an easy money policy or a loose money policy in which they lower interest rates to try to stimulate the economy, to get people buying, to get people investing, to get people taking out loans, and to try to jumpstart the economy that way. All right. And hopefully fiscal and monetary policy are kind of operating and acting together in common interests. Doesn't always happen, but hopefully that's the case. So anyway, when we're talking about that, things that you might see happening in the economy if the Federal Reserve decides that they're going to raise interest rates, you will need to take a look at the notes on the discount rate. All right, know your interest rates. So the discount rate, the federal funds rate. Make sure to know that when these interest rates, and they're all going to be acting the same, right? I mean, interest rates are going to pretty much follow a certain pattern. And let's say, for example, that you have a bank that has a lot of business in a particular time period. They have a lot of people coming there to take out loans. They have a lot of withdrawals happening in a certain time period. Those banks are required to have it's called a reserve requirement ratio. They are required to have a certain amount of funds in their banks at all times. That guarantees confidence in the banking system, and it guarantees that bank's not going to run out of money. If they fall below that reserve requirement ratio, however, they can get an overnight loan from the Federal Reserve. All right. The Federal Reserve in that capacity is serving as the bank of the banks. And so basically, that bank, all right, whether it be a commercial bank like a Wells Fargo or whatever it is, when they borrow money from the Federal Reserve, it comes at an interest rate on its own. All right, so that's the discount rate. Okay, that discount rate is going to be passed on to the people who are taking out loans. So that's the way that the Federal Reserve is really kind of tying this all together, and that's the way that they're kind of impacting you directly. Is if they are trying to discourage people from taking out loans, and if they're trying to discourage people from investing and stuff like that, then you might see interest rates rise from the Federal Reserve, which is going to be passed down to the banks, which is going to be passed down to you, all right, the person who is going to be taking out the loans. Likewise, one of the major, and this is not in the notes. Make a quick note about this. This is one of the major ways that the Federal Reserve is going to control the interest rates in today's world, and this is really since 2007, 2008. One of the main ways that they try to encourage or influence the economy is through interest on reserves. And basically, what that means is that you have money that is being kept in your bank. All right, and this is let's say that you're a banker. You want to bank your whatever it is, right? So you're at your bank, your business. It's just like any other business, right? The way that you make money is when people come in your doors and they are asking for a loan. All right, you give out that loan at a certain percentage. Let's say at 4% interest. All right, so they get the principal amount of the loan, but then they have to pay that loan back plus interest, plus that 4% interest, which is going to accrue monthly until they get that loan paid back. All right. Now, at that same bank, that same person who just took out a loan, they might have a savings account. Okay, that savings account could have, it's generally very, very small, like a 0.1 or 2% interest rate on it, but they're paying you to keep that money in your savings account, right? So they're paying you to keep that money there so that they can use it to give out loans, and when they give out loans, that 4% difference, that's how they make their money, right? Okay. And so if they can keep more money in reserves, and let's say that because the Federal Reserve, they have money that is sitting at the Federal Reserve that is designated if, Bank A, for example, if they need overnight loans, that they can get those loans. However, if they're trying to influence the economy to try to, let's say that they're trying to encourage spending, or they're trying to stimulate the economy in some way, they may pay a lower interest rate on the savings account, basically, of the bank that they have, right? That interest on reserves that the bank has at the Federal Reserve. Meaning that the bank stands to make more money if they give out more loans, and they have to overnight funds from the bank or whatever it is, and they give out more loans, they can charge a higher interest rate than they're basically getting paid on the interest that they keep in reserves. Likewise, if they're trying to discourage that from happening, if they're trying to rein in inflation or whatever it may be, then they could end up paying a higher interest rate than what people are going to be willing to take out a loan for. All right, and I'm hoping this makes sense. I know it's a lot, but they may be charging 6% interest rates on loans at this point in time, which not a lot of people are taking out, but they're getting paid from the Federal Reserve to keep their money in the Federal Reserve and not give out a lot of loans so that they need to overnight it to their bank. So interest on reserves, that's one of the major ways that they can influence the economy. Also, the buying and selling of bonds. When they are buying up bonds, they sell bonds, by the way, to the federal government. They also sell them to international players, international governments as well. But when they sell bonds to the federal government, the government is taking that, they're basically paying the Federal Reserve for those bonds. Those bonds will mature over time. The Federal Reserve is taking that money in, and what that does is it has basically a reining in, right? The government is paying the Federal Reserve for the bonds that they keep, these promissory notes that they keep. The money goes out of circulation and it reins in inflation. Likewise, when they are trying to spend that money into the economy, the government or the Federal Reserve might buy those bonds back from them, which floods the government with new money. All right, they buy those bonds, they pay the interest on the matured bonds, and then the government can take that money and spend it back into the economy. So make sure to look over that stuff on the PowerPoints as far as how the government is going to operate, all right, how the Federal Reserve and the government kind of work together as far as the buying and selling of bonds to either expand or to shrink the money supply, to either try to get the economy stimulated or to try to rein it in some way. I know I'm going to have a lot of questions tomorrow, so this is very complicated stuff. I will be there tomorrow starting at 8 o'clock. The test will still be at 10 o'clock, but just in case, if y'all have any additional questions, if y'all want to work through some things, if you want some one-on-one time, again, I'll be there at 8. All right, and I'll be there again. 10 is when the test starts, and we'll run it till 11. But you have as much time as you need. Let me know again if y'all have any questions about anything as you're going through the notes. All right, how this all fits together. There's a lot that's out there. All right, check out those other links, those extra links. I had one in there that kind of dealt with taxes and showing you where the tax money goes. That'd be an interesting one if you're interested in trying to find out exactly what the government's doing with your money. And we'll talk about some. I'll mention it tomorrow because it's not necessarily important for the class, but I'll talk about some things that the government spends money on that you might kind of shrug your shoulders at. But anyway, so when going back through, all right, definitely look over GDP, inflation, and unemployment. Look over those videos. Look over your PowerPoint for taxes, how they're administered, the structure of the taxes, and also the type of taxes, those 3 that we talked about, all right, property, sales tax, and income tax, federal income tax. And then look over fiscal and monetary policy. Know the tools that the Federal Reserve uses. Know the structure of the Federal Reserve. And know how the government and the Federal Reserve work to try to either increase or decrease economic activity. I know that's a lot. I'm expecting a lot of questions. All right, if you have any at all, please do not hesitate to text me on Remind. Happy studying. And again, I'll be there at 8 o'clock tomorrow, just in case y'all have any extra questions. Regular review session will start at 9. We'll start the test at 10. All right.